Good afternoon and welcome to the Dairy Signal. We're glad you could join us today. Today's topic is rethinking corn silage. Feed is one of the largest costs in a dairy operation, and corn silage plays a major role in both ration performance and profitability. Today, we'll take a look at strategies around seed selection, agronomic decisions, and other key inputs that can help improve silage quality, support cow performance, and get more value from every dollar spent on feed. We are pleased to be joined today by Dr. Louise Ferretto, with UW-Madison, and Dr. John Geiser with Progressive Dairy Solutions. Thank you both for being here today, and I'll turn it, actually, before we get started, I just wanted to say a quick reminder that this is a live program, so please feel free to ask questions. To do so, please click the three dots on the bottom right-hand corner to submit your question, and for those wanting to earn continuing education credits, there will be a quiz at the end of today's program. And I would also like to thank our sponsor. The sponsor is DLF. We'd like to thank them for joining the Dairy Signal. Success starts with the seed, and that's why us farmers trust DLF, the world's forage seed leader. Backed by cutting-edge research, DLF delivers high-yielding forage products with the traits producers need to drive profit on their farms. Ask your retailer about high-performance alfalfa brands like Forage First, 5 Series, Alpharex seeds, and you can learn more at lacrosseseed.com. With all that, I will turn it over to you, Dr. Louise and Dr. John.
Thank you, Haley, for the kind introduction and the opportunity to be here today. Always a pleasure to be able to contribute to the Dairy Signals, especially when we can collaborate with John and bring some discussion to the table. So, John, some thoughts for us to begin?
Absolutely. So we don't have a fun fact today, Haley. There's not anything that today signifies.
No more fun facts.
That'll be a challenge for us to come up with a fun fact. But for Luis and I, and for our dairy producer audience out there, our fun facts are always corn silage and animal nutrition and dairy nutrition related. So we're going to take a continued freestyle approach. Those of you that had listened in the past with myself and Luis, this actually stems from our business conference session, which humbly had the opportunity alongside Luis. I would consider Luis a friend and colleague, but getting into any and all things corn silage. This topic has been dear to my heart dating back to graduate school. So wrapped up my PhD in 2008 and had the humble pleasure of working with Randy Shaver and Jim Coors in graduate school. So I've got a unique pedigree in that I've studied and earned a master's in plant breeding genetics as well as animal science, and then did my doctorate with Dave Combs. So we've been working on this topic for quite some time. Luis is a fair bit younger and I would say better looking than I am. So, Luis, when did you get your PhD?
I completed my PhD in 2015, so I'm getting old, John. I won't lie to
I'm
you.
the old man in the room, right? But we're still hungry and learning every single day. And the topic of corn silage, Luis and I are certainly biased with a lot of the great work that has come out of Randy's lab and now Luis, your lab, such as Milk 2024. Maybe we can touch on that a little bit today. But when I got out of graduate school with my background, I mean, I don't know anything today, and I certainly didn't know a whole lot back then. I thought I had all these letters behind my name and the world was just going to open up and everybody would want to do business with me. But I learned pretty quickly that letters don't mean a whole lot. It's about your experience and what have you gotten done for me lately in terms of dairy producers and within the industry. The one area that I did get pulled into pretty quickly within the feed industry was seed genetics and looking at corn hybrids. And this would have been 2008, 2010. I found myself in a lot of discussions with dairy producers, their nutritionists, as I was doing some tech service work, talking about seed genetics and hybrids. And wouldn't you know it, there was a hot topic of brown midrib corn silage way back then, right? Nearly 20 years ago. Hot topic of should I plant BMR or should I plant conventional? And now here we sit. What's the year? 2026. So a couple of years later, Luis, what's still a hot topic?
So somehow, John, I think BMR is still a hot topic, but for a different reason, right?
Yeah.
I think fiber digestibility has been key for many, many years. But I think that this past year, I've been talking a lot about that. And the reason for that is this phasing out the BMR will face, especially by its primary manufacturer. So basically, I think that with the removal of BMR, from the market, people start discussing, oh, what do I do now? And I think that's quite interesting because a lot of people don't plant BMR and also ask those questions with
Mhm.
give us the opportunity to dive into this topic and keep going through some of the strategies that can help us with that, right? But if we go back to some of the topics that have been discussed, I'm going to say the last 10 years, but extremely revisited this past year, and some of the new topics, I will probably tell you that some of the key things that we hear about is shop height, right? Which is not a new topic, but people are certainly revisiting. Um, Feed hygiene, which a lot of people don't associate with fiber digestibility, but they should, is a topic that maybe some people don't phrase as feed hygiene. They probably should. But basically, what are the microorganisms that are out there and what can they do to your corn silage and more important, to your cows, right?
Mhm.
And then I think that the newest topic that we can think about is a new hybrid that the let's say that the common name that people are using for that is short corn. And I think it's something that will be quite intriguing to learn about because some people even compare, oh, this is the new BMR. I don't think we should treat hybrids as the new thing. I think we should have each hybrid as its own thing. But these are some of the novel topics or revisited topics that we have out there. What else are you hearing about in the field?
Well, so you hit on, I think you laid out four major topics in BMR, feed hygiene, chop height, rachitic dwarf, or short corn. I mean, those are four great areas that I would love to see us dive into. Let me let me just share in the last no lie 3 hours in my conversations en route to the dairy. I'm sitting in a one dairy client office today. We were talking about forage planning for the year ahead, what we need in terms of inventory and conventional versus brown midderb corn, because we've been feeding brown midderb corn at this dairy for quite some time. And then chop height. So on my drive over, some discussions with a very forward thinking managing partner of a dairy that actually looks after the agronomy in the field side of the business. And we were talking about chop height. And he posed a question, or he posed a statement that chop height in his mind hasn't penciled in terms of the gain in starch that we get with an increased cut height. Uh, and I said, "Oh, that's interesting, but there's another benefit to be found with increased cut height. So let's get to that. But secondarily, why don't we start with let's kick the tires on the what defines corn silage quality topic first, because regardless of what those four different areas, we have to have some shared understanding, or maybe there's going to be some disagreement, but at least some discussion in and around what defines corn silage quality, because I think that topic needs to be revisited. You're an expert and have done some leading research with Milk 2024, for example, and I have some of my own jaded, biased opinions. But let's kick the tires and talk a little bit on what defines corn silage quality, and when we look at, say, a feed test.
Absolutely. I think that from a nutritive value perspective, we have to combine nutrient concentration as well as digestibility, right? And if you think from a corn silage perspective, I think there are two key ingredients that we have um, to choose as our main goals, right?
Mhm.
First, fiber, right, which is the main topic we are discussing today. Fiber is a high proportion of the corn plant, but we also have to think about starch, right, which you just mentioned a little bit about part of this discussion. It does not mean that the other nutrients are not important, right? All it means is that from a corn silage perspective, those two nutrients, they are key because they are, I don't know, sometimes 40%, 45% of the plant composition, right? And obviously, if we talk about fiber, we need to understand digestibility. And if we talk about starch, we need to understand digestibility, because having a nutrient there but not being available does not help us either, right? So,
And I appreciate you describing nutrients and then digestibility as separate attributes or separate factors that contribute to corn silage quality. So as a nutritionist, I'll throw myself in front of the proverbial bus. We are enamored with discussing fiber digestibility. My PhD work centered specifically on that topic, but it is only one component of that definition of forage quality for corn silage that, and I would agree with Luis, we have to have suitable or starch levels at a high amount, matched up with then high fiber digestibility. So there are really four components at least that drive forage quality with corn silage and equate to the, I would say, high level of milk per ton that we're ultimately going to look for, or total digestible nutrient yield. Discussions in and around strictly fiber digestibility, in my opinion, are leaving short or missing out on other factors that contribute to the caloric value of corn silage, which really is more tightly correlated to economic potential. Because yes, with brown midrib corn silage, for example, there's a tendency, and research has documented, Luis, some of your meta-analyses have clearly documented increased intake potential with that corn silage, which if cows eat more, they tend to produce more milk. We don't necessarily see feed conversion efficiency gains with brown midrib corn silage. And so that's something also we need to take to heart, because if we put another pound of feed in cows and they turn that into milk, and some milk price markets, that's a good thing. But when we're at break even or below break even, more milk, but with a concurrent increase in feed intake may not necessarily be profitable. But we also need to take into account the calories we grow per acre relative to the input cost. And so seeking out, I would say, high levels of fiber digestibility at the expense of some starch and some grain yield, potentially at the expense of maybe a little bit poorer plant health, excuse me, or yield. Those need to be taken into consideration, because those are all factors that will influence your bottom line as dairy producers. We need to take into account the agronomic costs and considerations, the acres needed to feed the herd, as well as the intake and milk production in our economic scenarios. So, Haley, do we have any questions coming in from the sidelines? I would encourage all of our listeners, jump on Slido and throw stuff at us, because we can certainly pivot.
I did have one quick question regarding feed hygiene. Could you maybe walk through that a little bit and give us a little bit clearer of a definition on that?
Absolutely. Luis, can I cue this up for you?
Absolutely.
Put the ball on the tee, because you're an avid golfer. So let me set that ball on the tee for you so you can drive it 350 yards down the fairway. Feed hygiene are all the anti-nutritional components that may exist within forages or within the ration as it's presented to cows. Classically, these would be mycotoxins, maybe mold and yeast, but think about, like, so we just defined the nutritive characteristics, what defines quality in corn silage, and ultimately it's the factors that lead to the caloric value, or that milk per ton. Feed hygiene defines components in feeds that I'll look for Luis to discuss a little bit more, but that can rob our silage of caloric potential. We can have excellent forage quality, caloric potential, lots of energy per pound per ton. However, if we've got some spoilage organisms, some contaminants that Luis will discuss a little bit more, that can act like water in diesel fuel in terms of completely disrupting the energetic potential within the rumen. So appreciate, Haley, you asking about that. It's been an area that's been dear to my heart for quite some time. I never really learned anything from an academic perspective through my University of Wisconsin training on that topic, but certainly it's a big one. And through experience out in the field is something we're talking about just about daily. So, Luis, what are the factors that we look for in feed hygiene?
I think the key thing about feed hygiene is that involves a lot of things that we can predict and a lot of things we cannot predict, right? So I think from a corn silage perspective, one of the hot topics I think would be yeast counts or yeast contaminations that corn plants can have, right? And if you think about some of the factors that may affect that, obviously weather patterns, right? That we wish we had control, but we do not. But then there are other factors that we can work with in order to try to minimize the potential risk associated with that, right? For example, having a clean patio, make sure that equipment is clean during packings and transportation of silage. And then later, thinking about the cow, good feed out management to make sure that whatever yeast is present cannot proliferate fast enough so cows cannot consume that and have I'm going to call digestive upsets, if you will. Although, to be fair, we don't truly understand what's going on, right? But what we know about that is if you have a lot of yeast contamination for whatever reason, weather, different diseases, issues with hygiene itself during silage preparation or feed out, you should expect the cows will produce less milk. This could be related to intake, could be related to palatability, but is also related to fiber digestibility. And we don't know the mechanism, but we know that rumen digestion is impaired to a certain extent when we have a lot of yeast counts out there. And I think that's why this is so important, right? Because there are a lot of different avenues that those microorganisms could act and compromise, well, some of the hard work that you put into preparing that silage, right? Because there is also direct effects into the plant itself that may compromise nutritive value. We know for sure there is effect on starch. We just finalized a study that suggests there's also effect on fiber. So I think we have to account for that in different ways because certainly it's something that may be very detrimental. And we didn't even mention mycotoxins and the other factors, right? Usually they come all together, or at least a couple of those will be present together and consequently create some of those issues. What are some of the other issues that you see related to this topic, John, that farmers have to be careful about?
From a big picture standpoint, we want our listeners and producers out there that are listening in today or after the fact. These are not things that we can see with our eyes. We either need to do some laboratory testing, to do some specific feed hygiene testing. Infrared cameras can be very helpful because when Luis and I are discussing yeast, let's qualify spoilage yeast or epiphytic wild yeast. Let's classify that separately from probiotic good yeast, such as a baker's yeast. There are ingredients that we bring into rations that are bringing live cell yeast that can actually have a very beneficial effect on the rumen. So there are many different species of yeast, but as Luis and I are discussing yeast as one of the fungal contaminant components that can be present in feed, I think yeast is probably the biggest unrecognized concern or opportunity on dairy farms because we don't see it. We we recognize mycotoxins as a buzzword, and there are many companies out there that are offering to do mycotoxin testing on behalf of our dairies, and I certainly do that as a nutritionist to check the box and make sure we don't have mycotoxin contamination. But spoilage yeast in corn silage and in the ration, ideally, we don't want any spoilage yeast to be growing. And in terms of what we're seeing, this is a discussion point day in, day out. Like I said, I've been talking about feed hygiene just about every day for the last 6 to 12 months as I've stepped back into a nutrition role with my team here. And we see results of near zero, but in excess of 30 million colony forming units per gram. And so it's certainly a hot topic. One thing that we did, Luis, if you remember in the business conference, you remember when I grabbed my pinky?
Oh,
And
yeah.
so I'll walk through this with everybody. And if you're watching it on the computer, but I would encourage everybody, Haley, you as well, grab your pinky, grab the top knuckle of your pinky.
Yeah.
And this is a helpful exercise because the top knuckle of your pinky, think about that volume. It's not very big, right? It's one cubic centimeter roughly. And when feed labs measure yeast or any growing organism, bacteria or mold, they're measuring the colony forming units on that amount, that volume of feed. So if we get our result back on our corn silage, for example, or our TMR, and if we have 1,000, 10,000, or 30 million CFUs per gram, think about 30 million colony forming units of yeast in that volume of your pinky. And then think about how many pinky volumes, how many cubic centimeters cows consume every day. It is an unrecognized opportunity. And as far as coming back to look conventional versus brown bitter corn silage, for example. So if we want to achieve optimal caloric value and we want to seek to improve fiber digestibility, we also need to spend time making sure that there aren't components that will hinder fiber digestibility, such as spoilage yeast. So spoilage yeast is a big one. We also get into some discussions in and around negative or opportunistic bacterial growth within rations and within feeds. I don't think that's probably as big of a talking point as spoilage yeast, but mold growth and then mycotoxins, those would be kind of the other topics that exist or the areas that we look for within the feed hygiene. And as I look at feed hygiene, I write the feeding fundamentals column in Hordes. And so I went back to an article just yesterday that had written, I think last year or the year before, discussing the feed hygiene diamond. So I bring up the plant disease triangle as an analogous visual or schematic that is useful in this topic. When agronomists like Damon Smith, for example, they look for opportunities to prevent or discussed disease that may be happening, plant disease in the field from an agronomic perspective. Like if we want to predict a disease outbreak, whether it be a wild yeast contamination or other fungal disease like southern blight, we need a conducive environment. We need the pathogen or the I guess the inoculum to be present in the field, and then we also need a susceptible host. So that forms a triangle. There's three components of that triangle. If any one of those components are missing, then we don't have a disease outbreak. And so that's ultimately what we want, or we want to disrupt one of those components with a fungicide, for example. In the case of feed hygiene, as we're discussing here, I more consider that to be a baseball diamond with four bases. And Luis is not a huge baseball fan, being of Brazilian descent, right? So I've had to teach him about this crazy, crazy game we play here in the United States, this baseball. But we've got home base, first, second, and third. Think of the diamond as fungal contamination, being mold and yeast, like we're talking about here, mycotoxin contamination, bacterial contamination, and then the fourth component of that diamond is other stressors that the animal experiences, whether it be feeding, environmental, etc. And typically there's at least two, in some cases maybe three of those bases that we have some issues. So I think what as far as what we're hearing and talking about in the field, Luis, it's never just one thing, but there tends to be one thing that's a tipping point. And then when we do these hygiene diagnostic efforts where we look at all of the four bases, we seek to uncover where we have opportunities and then to prioritize them accordingly. And I'll come back to you. Spoilage yeast is a big one.
Oh, absolutely, Joe. And I think that the same way we are discussing all those issues with corn silage, this is for every crop, right? Because if you think from legumes, for example, the name of the game would be Clostridia or some sort of enterobacteria, and it's exactly the same type of deal, right? If you have any sort of contamination, it's going to trigger together with those other stressors that you discussed. But what they have in common is a lot of that comes from soil contamination, right? Which is a major issue. And I think that's actually even worse when you have dry years as well as very wet years, right? Because one accumulates dust, the other one basically splashes some of the dirt into the corn plants. And if we go back to the whole shop height discussion, that's another potential benefit associated with that, right? Because a lot of the dust that we see in dry years is in the bottom part of the plant. Obviously, it covers the entire plant, but I think the bottom part is where we see most of that. And also for wet years, right? Usually some of those droplets splashes in the soil basically bring some of that to the bottom part and could be another thing to consider from that perspective, right? Of course, that you have to think about your feed inventory and all the related, I'm going to say, issues and benefits associated with that. It could be another thing to take a look at.
So Haley, good luck keeping us on track. Are there any questions that we should address quickly?
Yes, I do have another question for you. This one is on corn varieties. What are your thoughts on short corn varieties? I'm hearing more about them, and are they holding up quality-wise?
All right, so can we pump the brakes on that one for a couple of minutes and then come back to that?
Absolutely.
Because that one's going to take us down a slightly different path. So
Absolutely.
here I'd ask you, are there any questions out there? And then I promptly shut you down. So I may not be invited back in the future. Luis, you may have to carry the baton on our behalf. Before we go to discussing brachytic dwarf, short corn, or other options that we should maybe take a look at and consider, how do we mitigate some of the contaminants? So you talked about chop height potentially being one, and I think we need to spend some time talking about chop height, maybe in the context of looking at like short corn versus high cut corn. But what are some strategies that we can consider to clean up the crop, so to speak, and ensure that we have the cleanest silage possible so that we can achieve that caloric value or optimize it?
I think scouting fields to make sure that we truly understand disease pressure is one of those things, right? Obviously, we also want to make sure the maturity is proper for silage making. But I think if you truly understand the issues that your crop is going through, you may prioritize harvesting that before you let that accumulate too much in the field. Obviously, Harvest time is always a controversial topic, depends on a lot of different things. We are not trying to minimize the importance of yield here at all. We are just trying to bring some of the factors associated with that. But this is something to consider. Other things that I think is quite helpful would be if you utilize perhaps a bacterial inoculant that can help mitigate some of those yeasts. Basically, when we think about bacterial inoculants, we are thinking about a specific bacteria that we're going to add to the silo in order to modulate fermentation, right? And in the case of yeast and molds, we need something to help us to have good initial fermentation, good lactic acid, but that produces also a reasonable amount of acetic acid, right? And the reason for that is acetic acid actually delays the proliferation of yeast and molds when we are feeding cows after opening the silo. So the key inoculant out there that will do that are those that are based on Lactobacillus buchneri. For the microbiologists out there, I apologize. I know lactobacillus is not lactobacillus anymore. They keep changing those names. But the buchneri type of inoculant actually shift fermentations towards acetic acid at a certain point. The way we measured that here in the lab is similar to the example you gave about the infrared camera, John, and it's probably related to that, right? Basically, what we do is we measure heat generation by the silage, which is what the camera catches in the infrared. So whenever you think about this is if yeast and molds are deteriorating your silage, the silage will warm up because heat is being generated by the deterioration process, right? So if you ever been to a feed bunk, put your hand in the TMR and you saw that the TMR is very warm and the cows don't want to eat, that's what we are talking about. Right. And I think the Buchneri helps to delay the process. So the palatability is still there, the quality is still there, and you have time to feed that before it start truly spoiling and creating issues.
Can I add something to that? I'll cite a couple of different studies. Don't ask me who the principal investigators were on the aerobic stability or the shelf life work. But as I've been discussing Buchneri inoculants with some dairies that have been inquiring of some different strategies to prevent yeast and mold growth upon feed out, I phrase it a little bit differently in that silage has a longer shelf life. Not that Luis and I are ever going to be happy with corn silage being defaced, say, a day or two ahead of time, but that's an unfortunate reality at times where we just need to stage feeds. And so corn silage, there's research behind this Buchneri bacteria. It will be stable for 50 to 100 hours longer than I would say a conventionally or untreated corn silage from an inoculant standpoint, which can really be valuable, so much so that it can carry into the total mixed ration and actually increase the shelf life of the total TMR to a measurable amount. So that I appreciate you mentioning that as one effective strategy for us to consider to clean not only the feeds up, but or the silage, but also the resulting ration and keep the yeast from growing.
Yeah,
I had another
absolutely.
thought, escaped
And
me.
and I think one thing that's interesting about this type of study is there was a recent study from the Miner Institute that tests palatability associated with that. And
Mm.
basically, what they did is they had the inoculated, no inoculated silo, and then they removed silage before or fresh to feed cows. They were basically feeding dairy heifers, okay? And basically, those dairy heifers, they chose the fresh silage, right? All the time, right? So that tells us how much those cows need the very good material to be present in the diet. So
Building on that, I remember the other point that I'd wanted to make a reference to Walker Vias, excellent scientist at University of Florida. I had seen this work when on the program last year at the Florida Ruminant Nutrition Symposium. Great conference. I would encourage folks to check it out. There's some great topics presented there. But DeWalker shared some, I think it was last year, maybe 25 or maybe it was 24, but had very similar to what Luis described. It had a treated and untreated silages and then fed them through a transition cow study and saw some notable differences in intake and performance
yeah.
with the fresh cows. That's some of the only data that I'm aware of relating to or suggesting there's an impact on milk production. We see it practically speaking. I know that high yeast counts are going to be a problem, and so we see some negatives. But as from an academic research standpoint, I want to make sure to cite DeWalker's work because it's pretty good. You'd also mentioned, Luis, Clostridia. So the topic is not necessarily corn silage today. And Haley, I promise we're going to come back to the short corn hybrid and variety discussion. But
Okay, I'll wait.
Clostridia with wetter halages, alfalfa grass silages, that has been, you'd think in 15 years brown bitter topic would have evolved, and you think in 15 years we would have maybe gotten a little bit better at preventing some clostridial forages, but Mother Nature has been maybe a little bit more volatile the last couple of years, and so there is quite a bit of clostridial silage or haylage out there yet. What are some strategies that we can consider to mitigate clostridial growth, that secondary fermentation in alfalfa or grass haylage?
Yeah, absolutely. And Clostridia is the type of thing that break cows bad, right? And it comes out of nowhere sometimes if you have a specific region of the silo, or especially because Clostridia takes a while to develop, right? It's not the kind of thing you open the silo immediately after the initial fermentation and you see that there. Sometimes takes 60, 90 days. So you may go from an interesting crop to a problem. And I think that the way I see Clostridia is we have to make sure fermentation is good, right? Obviously, all this soil contamination discussion we had applies for that. No doubts there. There's a lot of Clostridia in the soil. Okay, if you use your pinky again, John, and we talk about yeast molds, whatever, the soil has way more counts than silage. Okay, so that amount of soil coming to the silo, it's bad, right? So from that perspective, I think alfalfa and other legumes, sometimes grasses, they have a different type of fermentation than corn, right? They don't have as much water-soluble carbohydrates available, and some of those crops have a lot of protein, right? That's why we feed them, right? The problem of having protein in silage is that sometimes during fermentation, those are broken down into ammonia. Okay. And the real issue with ammonia is it buffers pH. So the pH that we want to be very low go up by the presence of ammonia. Okay. Undesirable microorganisms like Clostridia thrive when pH is not low enough. Like let's say 4.5, for example, right? 4.5 to 5, right? So if you don't have a fermentation that is fast enough to reach low pH and be with this low pH range throughout the entire, basically storage period, there is a chance that some Clostridia will proliferate if they are there, right? So I think that the key is to make sure that obviously the entire silage making process is good, but that fermentation drops fast enough. If we go back to this bacterial inoculant discussion we had, Buccaneer Rye is not your to-go product anymore, right? Probably you need something that actually prioritizes lactic acid. They're traditional inoculants, right? Those are the, let's call the oldest inoculants. That's how the inoculant business started, right? Bacteria that you put into those silage products, and they have a lot of those bacteria that generates or produces a lot of lactic acid. pH drops very fast, and then hopefully stay lower throughout the entire period.
Are there any inoculant strategies that you would prioritize for forages that would be, say, higher moisture if we've got rain coming and we need to make a decision to harvest that forage as opposed to letting it get rained on a considerable amount, which would then wash out some of that soluble carbohydrate, which could drive fermentation. So we find ourselves in some challenging situations where we need to make decisions that it may be in our best interest to harvest that silage sooner than later, or haylage, I should say.
Yeah. With very wet silage, we have to be careful because sometimes the inoculants, they are not as great as we would like, right? And a few years ago, I watched a presentation about grass silage related to that. And this is one of the biggest issues that they had in Florida. You mentioned the Florida Ruminant Nutrition. I was thinking about that. And under those conditions, sometimes you may want to also consider other type of additives, right? Different types of acids, for example,
Sure.
propionic acid, for example. I usually think about propionic acid as the potential savior when you have all that silage warming up, so you can kind of stabilize that for palatability a little bit. But it also could play a role into helping us stop this type of fermentation during the silage fermentation process. So this is something else that we could consider. If you want to still go with bacterial inoculants, there are inoculants out there that were tested under wet conditions. You just have to search for them. Make sure you ask your dealer or if it's your nutritionist or consultant that you work with, to dig further information, because there is some information out there of bugs that work better under those conditions. Because remember, bugs are all different, inoculants are all different, so you want to make sure you get something that is proven. So
I appreciate you mentioning the chemical path. So some acids, for example, 1 or 2 pounds per ton isn't going to make a difference. If we think about bacterial-driven fermentation that adds 2.5% on a dry matter basis, fermentation acid, that's 15 pounds of acid per ton. That's a bare minimum. So keep that number in the back of your mind from a management standpoint, especially if we have rained on forage that's, say, got an inch or two of rain on it. And there may not be any sugar there to drive fermentation. An inoculant might not have the greatest potential there just because it's missing its fuel source. So if we decide, hey, let's try a chemical approach and an acid approach, 15 to 20 pounds per ton would be equivalent to what a fermentation would create. All right, so we need to come, Haley. Are there any other questions on the hygiene or fermentation topic? But then we can dive back into the short corn.
We can jump into the short corn, yes. Would you like me to
Excellent. So
repeat the question?
no, we're good. I think I got you.
Awesome.
So they, I'll cue it up in that in the last summer I had learned from Natalia De Leon Gotti at the University, also of Wisconsin. I'm biased, right? Promoting our Badgers and College of Ag and Life Sciences as much as I can, but some great scientists, Luis included there. Natalia is on the plant breeding team at Wisconsin, and she's working on forage genetics. We got down to discussing, she was asking me with another one of her colleagues, Harkar, what we look for, what we're talking about from a nutrition perspective with Wisconsin dairy producers and in the ag industry. And we got to discussing the different components of corn, the stover, the leaves, the cob, in terms of fiber digestibility. And we know in the case of alfalfa, if we would compare and contrast alfalfa versus corn silage, the more leaves we have with alfalfa and less stem we have is going to be more protein, but also far more digestible fiber because the leaf tissue in alfalfa is far more digestible in terms of fiber digestibility than is the stem. Well, corn follows suit. And I didn't quite understand this, but now that I've been thinking about it and talking about it over the last year, the leafy tissue is the most digestible fiber. The midrib within the leaf, not so digestible. The stover, certainly not very digestible. And then the cob is not very digestible at all. So then from a management standpoint, cue up discussion on chop height, or from a seed genetic standpoint, leaf or more leafy material, more leafy tissue, and less stover, less midrib is going to relate to higher digestible fibers. So Luis, what are we seeing out here from this short corn? What are some considerations that we should take, and what's your intrigue level at this point?
I'm very intrigued by short corn. I'll tell you that I'm always fascinated by trying those new hybrids, new technologies. For me, it's also job security. So I think it's quite important that people keep developing that. But jokes aside, I think that short corn is quite interesting because it has shorter internodes. So basically, we have a plant that is shorter, but supposedly has the same amount of leaves, the same year or the same amount of grain, if you will. So it brings a different perspective to this. Okay. The initial trials that were conducted suggest that it has lower lignin concentration. And because of those lower lignin concentrations, it has greater NDF digestibility. So there is some research done in vivo, in vitro, that suggests that. But obviously, is a brand new topic, right? I think that from my perspective, I saw two different things, right? Plot work, right? If you think about hybrid comparisons, especially in vitro NDF digestibility. Initial work was done in Europe, and then there is some work done here in the US. You mentioned a little bit about the work done here in Wisconsin. I'm going to say our team, but I'm not necessarily part of that. Okay, so don't give me credit for that. Give credit to them. Is doing a great job trying to understand several different things about that. But the key point is NDF digestibility looks greater than conventional hybrids. Okay, sometimes to a similar number or value to what BMR used to pose into some or put into some of those hybrid trials, which to me is extremely intriguing because it's not easy to do that. Right, shop height sometimes don't get to that digestibility level. Right, so we have to think about that. But what is also quite interesting is that sometimes the starch is the same or higher than the conventional hybrids. And I think that's quite important because one of the downsides of BMR always was the 2 to 3 percentage units lower starch concentration. Like Joe Lauer put together multiple reports on the historical data, right, from the hybrid trials conducted here, and that was very consistent. Right. For short corn, we are seeing something different. We either keep starch the same or we get a little bit more starch, which I think is great, right? Because this way we have another thing to consider for nutritive value. If
It's
we
all about
move
the
that,
calories.
if we move that towards the cows, short corn is quite interesting because, as far as I know, there are very few trials. I help with a study in Italy. There is a study from Michigan State. Hopefully, soon we're going to have studies here. But they are very consistent. Cows produce more milk, but we didn't see drastic changes in intake. So that leads me to say two different things. First, short corn is not the new BMR because it looks like a different mechanism. Luis, what's the mechanism? Have no clue. We have to learn. Okay. But it also looked consistent, which I think is quite good because give us a good reason to test that and suggest people to consider that. Right now, there are a lot of things we don't know, right, and a lot of things that we're going to have to adjust associated about using short corn. I'll tell you first what I don't know. Okay, our studies in Italy had the plant population much higher than the conventional hybrids. The trials here in the US do not. Okay. The numbers that I heard in the industry about how to plant short corn, they also are variable. So my first question would be, what is the correct plant population, seeding density, whatever you describe for that? What is the correct one? And that I don't think we know. What are you seeing in the field, John? Did you see this type of variation, comments, or?
I'm privy to a fair number of plots and commercial or producer efforts that are not ever going to be published, not ever going to be made public. And in a lot of these situations, especially if they're plots or demo trials, the plant population is going to be similar throughout the plot. So it may be 35,000, and then we just run out the short corn alongside the conventionals or any other seed genetic technologies that may be in there. And what I can say across the board is that I also share your intrigue. I tend to look at the total digestible nutrient density. So it's that starch, it's that fiber digestibility, kind of all summed up into one number that to me is gives me some idea on calories. It's sort of like your milk per ton, but dumbed down for it's the Gazer number because I'm not smart enough to fully undo the milk per ton, but then also seeing yield. So then we'll multiply yield with the energy concentration. We'll look at TDN yield, essentially calorie yield. And short corn is as good or better than conventional in a lot of cases. I think in part due to that bump in caloric potential and fiber digestibility as well as starch, like you mentioned before. And then the yield is in the mix with conventionals. I won't say it's the same, but it's in the mix. And then when coupled with that bump up in calorie density, I'm really intrigued with short corn. So working with dairies to do test trials on farm, test plots, get some of our own hands-on experience because the agronomic practices and management, as far as where do we need to be for populations, what does our crop protection look like, fertility plans, et cetera, it's a different beast.
Oh, absolutely. And and I'm happy to hear that people are testing that out there because it doesn't hurt to have more options, right, for us to choose from a fiber perspective and also starch, right? If we have good amount of starch, I don't think it hurts at all. Another thing that I'm very curious about on how this is going to work is because of the size of the plant, how do we get into the shop height discussion? Do we need
Mhm.
new types of equipment and so on? So it brings different perspectives, right, that we have to think about because the ear is much lower than a ear in a traditional corn. So we have to kind of pay attention to those as well. Did you see anything related to that, or do you
We
have any
feel
comments?
Yeah, I certainly do. Had have a lot of questions on that as we've been discussing short corn in various circles. And so here in Wisconsin, I would say we would be as low as 6 to 8 inches, and some of the dairies that I work with are up in excess of 20 inches of cut height. Of course, it's going to depend upon the year and the stature, but really pushing the envelope on cut height. And I'll ask you in a minute to talk about that and the impact on conventional corn as another management strategy. But I don't know that our traditional 6 to 8 inch cut height is going to be appropriate. We may need to drop that head down a little bit. Some have been concerned that can we even do it? Well, a lot of our custom cutters out in California, the good men and women driving those machines out in California, they've proven and shown us that you can cut all the way down an inch or two and ultimately end up with a little bit more dirt, but you can make silage. So I think we'll be able to manage it with the conventional equipment. I don't know that we're going to need to re-engineer our machines or come up with different heads. We're just going to need to set the head height or set that height potentially a little bit differently with short corn relative to conventional. So that's absolutely a discussion point, one that we need to be thinking about as we're trialing it. Haley, what do we got out there? Are there more questions coming in on the topic?
Yeah, I actually just had a question on how fast do you see people adopting short corn? Do you think this is something that's going to take off rapidly, or is it people are going to be slow to adopt?
So in Italy and in Europe, the programs were rolled out a few years ahead of us here. So I want to give a plug out or give a shout out to Dr. Andrea Bellingeri and Antonio Gallo and some of the great scientists over there that have done some work. Antonio worked with his clients, and I think in some cases 25 to 35 commercial dairies that did some strip trialing, and it was about 2 to 3 years where we went from sort of exploratory to being a little bit more mainstream. I don't think it's going to be any faster than that. I appreciate a little bit more of the cautious nature to rolling out and exploring the seed genetic potential for silage as well as corn. So I think it's going to be years, looking at over the next 2 to 3 years, but we certainly need to be spending some time and effort on evaluating it, maybe not this year, but definitely when we want to get in the mix. Luis, what are your thoughts?
Oh, I highly agree. And this is the same process for every new type of hybrid that's out there, right? Whenever there is a new hybrid, people should not just randomly adopt those. They should do their own testing and see how that works for their conditions. And because let's be honest, right? University study is done under our conditions here. Sometimes it's way more controlled than what you have in a dairy farm. Sometimes not. There are farms out there that probably do a much better job than we do too. But so I think people have to try those slowly and understand how does that change the dynamics of their corn production system. Then after that, they have to understand how does that change their feeding system and make sure that everything works. And I think that the companies that sell those hybrids, they understand that, right? So a lot of times they are ahead of the market trying to actually run commercial trials and plots, anything you can think about in order to start exposing those and seeing what producers think about that and then making changes associated with that. So it is a process, and I believe it was like this for BMR too. Although for that one, I'll tell you, I was not here when that happened. So I believe you were not already established either, right, John? So
No. Haley, any other questions on the topic?
Not on that topic. I do have another one going back to fiber digestibility though, so I can save it or we can go with it.
Uh, well, let's talk a little bit about cut height because I want to make sure we get some of those points out, given that I
Perfect.
carried some discussion on that this morning, but that relates to fiber digestibility as well. So maybe your question will relate to that. But Louise, can you give us the Cliff Notes version or executive summary of what you and Cole and your research have found through meta-analyses with regards to cut height? We want to throw some benchmarks out there for our audience to consider.
yeah, absolutely. So when we run our meta-analysis, we were trying to better understand uh, linear relationships between nutrients and the changes that we had together with the changes in cut height, right? So basically, after that, what we did is we put together a spreadsheet where we could basically try to predict some of those changes, and basically some of the numbers that you should expect is for every 10 inches of increase, very likely you have about 2.5 percentage units increasing in the FD, about the same amount of increasing in starch, but then you have a half a ton decrease per acre in dry matter yield. I think those are the three key numbers that we have to think about.
That's perfectly said. And referencing back to my discussion with the producer this morning on the drive over, he had cited the roughly 2 unit, and Luis, it's 2.5 units increase in NDFD, 2.5 units in starch, but that producer was only doing the economic analysis based on that increase in starch, because if we cut higher, then it's going to be the same grain and just less over. So certainly we're going to see an increase in starch. But we can't just do our economic analysis based on that gain in starch. We have to account for that increase in fiber digestibility as well to then look at the trade-off against that half ton, and that's on a dry matter basis. So we're talking about 1.5 tons as fed for our listeners out there. So 1.5 tons as fed, that's what we're giving up. That's the cost for a 2.5 unit gain in NDFD, 2.5 unit gain in starch for every 10 inches. To me, that's a slam dunk, at least something that we should be looking at each year.
But something that's very important to consider too is that shop height effects are probably also related to which hybrid you use, your agronomic management, weather, maturity, and so on. Okay. We try to account for some of those factors when we work with that. But unfortunately, there are not a lot of trials that account for many of those. So the only thing we could properly test was maturity. Okay. So drier plants benefit more than immature plants when you are increasing shop height. So for those of you that do, and I don't know if people harvest that, but if you are in the 30 to 32% dry matter, the benefit is lower than if you harvest like 36 to 38% dry matter. Okay, assuming dry matter is a good indicator for maturity. Okay, please be careful with that. Okay, I'm not trying to suggest that, but I'm just trying to show you that the more mature plants benefit better or more from this approach compared to immature plants. And I'm sure that there are other interactions with other factors that we don't truly understand. So testing shop height similar to what you test hybrids is also very important. So
I'll throw a couple of speculative comments out with regards to maturity, but also drought corn, right? So I appreciate you bringing up the potential of interactions that this gain with chop height may not be appropriate for every situation. So if heaven forbid we end up with a drought this year, which many are not, we're on the other end of the spectrum, we're plenty wet for those farming east of the Rockies, but drought years, chop height is not going to be a discussion point for us. Whereas I would say normal years or light years like last year with taller statured corn, those would be the situations. Another situation where I think chop height would warrant some discussion would be if we have plant disease coming in. And one other point, so similar to how leafy tissue is more digestible than stover, green leafy tissue is going to be more digestible and more valuable than would be dead necrotic tissue. So that within plants that are diseased or maybe overly mature. So if we had a diseased field and or we just had more dead tissue, it may be beneficial to raise that cutter head up just to limit some of that less digestible material, leave some of that in a field. So a lot of these are going to be dependent upon the situation. Work with your consulting agronomist, nutritionist, take a look at what impact it may have in the diet. So Haley, I know we're getting up against the top of the hour. Finish us out with that question on fiber digestibility. Did we touch on that a little bit? If you wouldn't
Yes,
mind.
I think you guys have kind of covered it throughout the episode. I'll just ask it, and if you want to summarize any other key points. But it was, what are some out of the box ways farmers can improve fiber digestibility? Like I said, I think we've covered a few of those already, but if you have any others that you'd like to add.
I'll just do a quick recap of what we covered, sort of summarization, and I'll ask Luis to sort of play color commentary or fill in any holes. So cut height, more leafy tissue relative to stover, more green leafy tissue relative to dead necrotic tissue. There's going to be differences in seed genetics, so brown bitter versus conventional, certainly. Short statured corn, whether it be by way of more leafy material or if there's some other mechanism at play, may be an option for us to increase fiber digestibility. And then also ensuring that we don't have contaminants, we don't have fungal or bacterial or just other pathogenic feed hygiene issues that would disrupt the rumen metabolism. That we want to make sure we've got clean feed as well so that we don't undermine or crater the fiber digestibility potential we have. Luis?
no, I think that's summarized quite well. It's those are all key points that we have to pay attention to. The only other thing I will mention is for our agronomist colleagues out there, crop consultants, there's also the very important part about plant health. right? So everything you can do to optimize plant health is quite desirable from a fiber digestibility perspective.
I think I'll add another couple of points, and this is has been a discussion, potentially a point of debate, but I think there's something with plant populations, with higher plant populations potentially being less digestible fiber that probably relates to the stover and maybe the width of the stover in regards to the rind versus the pith. Um, and then there's got to be something with regard to soil fertility and, like Luis mentioned, plant health that we don't quite have understood. I can't tell you that this level of nitrogen or this level of phosphorus that agronomists have taught us is going to have an impact, but there's got to be something relative to soil fertility that also would influence that plant morphology and fiber digestibility. So those are another couple areas that we could talk about.
Yeah, the soil fertility, unfortunately, I don't remember seeing a lot of new research, although to be fair, is an area that I don't follow that closely. But some of the things that I heard in the past that people discuss a lot is potassium supplementation to the soil, which does play a role into the fiber digestibility. So something to talk about with your uh, crop consultant, make sure everything is good to go. And sometimes your soil is already perfect, so adding extra may not help, but it follows a little bit of this discussion that we had exactly the same way. So,
Awesome. Any final thoughts from either one of you? Final points?
Now, we appreciate the platform collaboration with professional dairy producers, having contributed to the business conference alongside Professor Luis. I had a blast thinking back a little ways, and hopefully we have some thought-provoking topics and discussions that our audience, both live and after the fact, are interested in learning and talking more about. We're readily accessible, so I contribute in an adjunct capacity at the University of Wisconsin alongside Luis. But like you mentioned before, Haley, it's not too hard to find me. So if you want to follow up with any discussion after the fact, just go on Google or use your favorite AI large language model and put my last name in, Goeser, and you'll be able to find my contact information pretty quickly. And I would welcome carrying the discussion forward.
Awesome. Awesome.
yeah,
Awesome.
absolutely. Thank you, Haley, for the opportunity. Always great collaborating. And like John, if you have any, especially for those that are uh, with the recordings rather than live, feel free to reach out with any questions you have. Always glad to discuss. And for those of you that are live and remember questions later, please don't hesitate. Always glad to help.
Awesome. Well, thank you both so much for your insights and conversation today. It was a lot of fun to learn more about our corn silage topic. And thank you again to DLF for sponsoring today's episode of the Dairy Signal. And thank you to everyone who tuned in and participated today. We appreciate your engagement. And with that, we look forward to seeing you on the next episode of the Dairy Signal.